In this lecture, we will survey the historical and aesthetic context for the genre of the novel in preparation for our discussion of Voltaire. Voltaire was born a little higher than Pope into the middle class. His family came from farming and trade, but his father was a lawyer and minor government official. Like Pope, he was raised Catholic and given a Jesuit education, although Catholicism in France had a much stronger presence than in Britain, and ultimately Voltaire grew up to be a deist. Also like Pope, Voltaire found entry to the aristocratic society by using his wit. He caused all sorts of trouble throughout his life. When we think of the fight for individual freedom during the Enlightenment, we think of Voltaire. By the time he was 22, he was exiled from Paris and locked up in the Bastille, a political prison, for what was seen as treasonous and blasphemous satire against Philippe d'Orléans, the regent of France. However, he was only locked up for a year and wasn't treated too badly. He was allowed his books, dined with the prison governor, and wrote his tragedy Oedipe while there. After he was released, he adopted his pseudonym Voltaire, staged Oedipe, and received immediate accolades, including a gold medal, fame, and recognition, even from the French regent who had just imprisoned him. His relationship with the aristocracy continued to be an on-again, off-again affair for the rest of his life. Sometimes he was popular and very well paid, and at other times he was exiled from France and he was locked up at least one more time in the Bastille. However, he never let prison and exile stop him from writing. He'd smuggle his work across borders, carried by hand in suitcases or by trusted friends rather than by post, and he felt compelled to write, for his time in prison made him realize that he'd always be an outsider, and rather than try to simply climb the social ladder, he committed himself for life to battling against prejudices, that is, in the original sense of the word, prejudgment, or the acceptance of ideas before subjecting them to reason. In the debate of the ancients and moderns, he is a modern because he critiques authority and traditional intellectual, religious, and political institutions. He spent his exile from France in London, where the English had already beheaded their king, and while there he met many of the greats, including John Locke, the philosopher on human reason, and Pope and Swift, fellow satirists. He lived freely. After his stay in London, he returned to France, his exile being over, and he lived with the philosopher Madame du Châtelet, along with her husband, in a ménage à trois, until she died in childbirth. The relationship was a partnership of both mind and body, she being highly intelligent herself, and the two together perusing thousands of books together. In 1750, he accepted an invitation to the court of Prussia's king, Frederick the Great. Unlike other Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire supported the idea of a monarch as long as the monarch was enlightened. He didn't trust the masses to make decisions as in a democracy. And Frederick the Great loved the arts and wanted philosophy and literature to flourish. But the Prussian king also waged violent wars, and Voltaire disagreed with the way he wielded his power. And after several disagreements, the king eventually asked Voltaire to leave. We can see some similarities between the Prussian king and the king of El Dorado and Candide. For instance, both disallowed the free travel of its citizens beyond national borders. Voltaire died in 1778, soon after he saw the success of his last tragedy, Irene, lauded by the entire capital in Paris. There is actually an interesting apocryphal story about his deathbed. Voltaire was asked to repent, and in his usual witty manner, he replied, "Now is not the time to be making enemies." But the story is, admittedly, likely gossip. Instead, we do know that he wanted to be buried half in and half out of the chapel, with the engraving on his tombstone, quote, "To God, erected by Voltaire," with Voltaire in all caps as if he's delivering a gift to God. But his body never made it to the gravesite. Transferring corpses just wasn't what it is today, and instead he was disguised, smuggled, and buried under the cover of darkness at an abbey outside of the city limits. The Archbishop of Paris had refused him a Christian burial. His original burial site was supposed to be in Ferney, where he had lived his last years. Ferney was a border town between France and Switzerland, specifically picked by Voltaire for its geographic location so that he could easily escape from France if necessary, while at the same time allowing him to stay in France as the nation of his home and heart. It was here at Ferney that he wrote Candide, and in the final garden scene of Candide, we have some allusion to Voltaire's own gardens at Ferney, which he spent much time cultivating, gardening being what Voltaire considered a noble pursuit, both beautiful and pragmatic. He died at the age of 84, but published Candide at the age of 65 in 1759. He did not admit authorship until 1768, 10 years before his death, when he was perhaps the most famous living author in Europe. Pope's essay on man takes on a classical form. It uses heroic couplets or rhyming lines of iambic pentameter, is reminiscent of an epic journey as he invites his friend Bolingbroke to, quote, expatiate free or explore the, quote, latent tracks and giddy heights of the scene of man, as he says in his first stanza. And the whole idea of exploring the scene of man as a, quote, wild where weeds and flowers promiscuous shoot, or garden tempting with forbidden fruit, as he says in lines 7 through 8, alludes to the larger-than-life parallel to a biblical exploration of the Garden of Eden. In In fact, Pope's essay on man bears some similarities to John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is also a theodicy and sought to justify the ways of God to man. The idea here is that Pope is inviting his friend Bolingbroke to join him on an intellectual journey to understand the problem of evil and man's place in the cosmos. Voltaire's Candide is a direct response to Pope's essay on man. Note lines 16 through 17 of Pope's essay, which read, quote, "Laugh where we must, be candid where we can, but vindicate the ways of God to man." Here Pope is announcing that he is taking on the philosophical approach of optimism, hence the laughter and frankness, or in other words, Pope ultimately believes in the goodness of God and dignity of man. Voltaire challenges this optimism. He doesn't believe in the automatic assumption that God is good, or in the widespread Enlightenment belief in man as a noble and perfectible creature, and his frankness, contrary to Pope, reveals a biting and acerbic laughter. Voltaire's naive protagonist, aptly named Candide after the very words Pope uses in line 16, leads audiences to laugh bitterly at humankind's and the world's shortcomings. Thus, Voltaire turns Pope's optimism upside down. So let's talk about the form Voltaire uses. In 18th century Europe, form is incredibly important for giving shape to the content of a text. Pope used what is considered a high form with epic elements, as mentioned earlier. The suggestion is that the content in Essay on Man is universal or applicable to all, and thus a matter suitable for serious intellectual contemplation. Lower forms of art in the West at this time were associated with the lyric or emotional expressions of the self. The content is too particular to be noble. Thus, when particulars were referenced, for instance, when specific references were made to current historical events, they were often framed in a way so that they'd be representative of universal ideas and concerns. For instance, Voltaire references the disastrous Lisbon earthquake, which shook the faith of many in Europe as it led people, including Voltaire, to seriously question whether God can actually be good if he allows so many to die. Here, a particular event is elevated to speak to a universal concern about the problem of evil. The form of Voltaire's Candide does not take on a typical high form of art, though, and in fact Voltaire's form is not easy to pin down, but we can look at where it's coming from and where it's going. That is, in this video, we'll look at the medieval romance as the genre form out of which Candide grows, and the novel as the genre form towards which Candide grows. And in the discussion forums, we'll identify how Candide meets or doesn't meet the characteristics of each genre. Candide is coming from the genre form of the romance. The romance is a medieval form that some of you may be somewhat familiar with already. The well-known Arthurian legends with King Arthur, Queen Guinevere, and the Knights Round Table are romances. For our class, we can consider the romance as typified by four basic characteristics: fantasy, the vernacular, novelty, and courtly love. Fantasy includes magical or unrealistic events, as well as magical or fairy creatures like dragons and wizards. The vernacular includes the novel's use of not just a common language like English or French, but also the informal manner of speaking which characters in the narrator might have. Novelty refers to the ways the text breaks from tradition, for instance by referring to current events and politics, and courtly love typically refers to love between upper-class peoples. It often involves a conflict of duty and desire. For instance, in the Arthurian legend, Sir Lancelot is faced with a conflict of duty and desire, duty to his king, King Arthur, as well as desire for his queen, Queen Guinevere. Courtly love also often involves a plot trajectory of loss and recovery, where a lover, reputation, or possession may be lost, but then recovered over the course of the story. Beyond the medieval romance, Candide is moving towards the genre form of the novel. The novel is a form that comes from the romance, so it retains some, but not all of the characteristics of the romance. For instance, it retains the emphasis on novelty by focusing on everyday life, places, events, and people, but by focusing on the everyday and common, it doesn't have to and often doesn't involve courtly love, which necessitates characters of the upper class. By focusing on the common, the novel also rejects the traditional plots and devices of fantasy, instead focusing on verisimilitude, or plots and characters that resemble actual life. This move towards realism was galvanized by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, who placed emphasis on observing reality in order to gain knowledge of one's self and the universe. Like the romance, the novel does retain a focus on the vernacular, though, which means using language that may be accessible, plain, informal, and specific, as opposed to poetic, arcane, and erudite. Keep in mind that these are broad rules, though, so as we proceed this semester, we'll see how some of them are played with or stretched by later writers. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the novel emphasizes the individual. Again, inspired by John Locke's focus on subjective empiricism, or the individual experience, the novel typically focuses on the development of an individual in terms of intellect, social status, political position, spirituality, and so forth. In this way, the novel differs from the romance, which places emphasis on the plot and actions. Thus, whereas a novel might focus on the development of an individual character, the romance might focus on a character's feats, like killing a lion, slaying a dragon, or defeating an army. More specifically, the novel form that Candide takes after is the sentimental novel. The sentimental novel was an incredibly popular form of literature by the end of the 18th century, and it focused on the development of characters and readers' morals. The sentimental novel is a form of literature that is supposed to exercise a person's sensibility, and sensibility can be understood as referencing one's sensitivity to beauty and justice. The idea of sensibility comes once again from John Locke's philosophy of the mind, whereas Locke believed that humans are all born blank slates, though the philosophy around sensibility theorized that humans are born with a sense of the beautiful, which, when guided by reason, can be used to understand the good and the true. For instance, when we see a man dying on the street, this offends our senses. The scene may appear ugly or disgusting, and thus we know it to be a symptom of society's cruelties and injustices. However, even though humans are all born with a sense of the beautiful, we must continually exercise our sensibility or senses just as we would a muscle. The more we exercise our sensibility, the more moral we become. We will improve our sense of benevolence or goodwill towards others, and ultimately we will be capable of individually and collectively achieving a more virtuous state for ourselves and others. It is partially in response to this philosophy and movement of sensibility that we see so many philanthropic social reforms tending to the rights of the poor, the enslaved, and the female toward the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries, towards the end of the Enlightenment. In the sentimental novel, then, we can expect to see a sentimental hero, or a person of feeling, a person who has a strong sense of reason and justice, or otherwise is at least naive, good-natured, and generally childlike. He may not act, but is acted upon, and reacts. The responsibility for his actions is shifted elsewhere, and he's generally humorless and witless, indicating his inability to manipulate the world around him. He does pity others, though, and in sentimental novels we can expect to see a lot of crying, and readers themselves are supposed to cry. Crying indicates that one is attuned to the suffering of others, and thus that one is sensible or has strong sensibility. Other characters in the novel, though, may be self-serving, callous, and hypocritical. The sentimental hero typically embarks on a journey to cultivate a sense of social goodness. His journey must take him away from home to signal a move away from the familiar, limiting, and/or provincial, and he may even be an orphan, signaling the need for a journey for him to find some sense of self. The journey is typically relayed in an episodic fashion or with a series of events that he experiences. The episodic form, in part, is shaped by the Enlightenment impulse to gather and amass knowledge and experiences. Also, by the end of the sentimental novel, the hero doesn't have to actually be changed. He may remain unfailingly optimistic in the face of the world's injustices. In this case, it is actually the readers who are the individuals experiencing development and growth as we sympathize with a character or characters. The sentimental novel itself is an optimistic form of literature because it assumes that all we need as readers is to be reminded of our latent goodness to inspire us to change. This is opposed to satires of the time, which assumed that humankind must be reminded of and chastised for our shortcomings in order to effect change. It's important then to know that Candide exhibits many characteristics of the sentimental novel in order to satirize them. By the early 19th century, we'll see the focus on feeling and sensibility give way to romanticism, which we will cover later in the semester.